We are here to bring you a live stream today on the incredible policies of a certain Mr. Donald Trump and the great victory that he has obtained. We will be going into, of course, all the details of this in due course. But first of all, we will greet those who are in the chat. Nehat, who's asking for the Discord link. So I'm just going to oblige you by putting that into the chat straight away, if you'll just bear with me. Right, let's have a look. Okay, and right, I'll just make sure that that's in there. So there we go. Okay, so that should make its way to the chat now. So hello to also to President Jesus, coming to us live from a land that is always winning, which is the land of Gavin Newsom. Hello to Albert Almir, who says Trump already caved on tariffs for electronics. What an embarrassment! At least he's getting me billions from insider trading. If Nancy Pelosi wasn't in on it, she's got to be jealous. Though. It's just another gang doing the insider trading. I mean, the insider trading is not the reason why this was done. This is just the way in which these people these people always conduct themselves this way. There's no real change between Democrat and Republican. This is just the way it's done. They regard it as a completely normal way of doing business. Albert's been listening to Michael Parenti's talk on imperialism and drugs. Very interesting. Hello to Richard. Hello, and hello to Rob. So, greetings to all of you and to everybody else who has joined us thus far. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Going to be starting proper in just a moment. I'm just navigating my way over to the YouTube chat to make sure we've got everything set up there. So, okay. Right, okay, here we go. So for some reason the Rumble Studio chat is running a little behind. I'm not quite sure why. So what I'm going to be doing is just pulling comments from the YouTube chat directly. So who else have we got here? We've got Ash. Good morning to you. Hello to Robeson. Hello to Victor. And also to Tim Gray, Rob from the wrong side of the Pennines, Almir, David Greenwood, Terry Brown, David Ball from Trenton, New Jersey. Jawad, good evening to you, comrade. Shady X joins us from South Africa. And hello to Heidi from Edinburgh. YepX, the next Q&A is going to be on, let me just do the mathematics in my head, Tuesday of next week. And good evening to Luca, and who says, what will the US ruling class do when the tariff policy fails? Back to QE. Good question. We'll come to it later. Hello to Judith and to Mo1917, Andrei Selyuku from Calgary, Stig Pedersen, Evgeny Nikolaev, Tracy Wilkinson, Johan Krober, Edward from Latvia, who says, Labvaka Biedri. In Latvia, there is a new level of Russophobia because of Trump's tariffs, oddly enough. Even everything here is because of Russians and Russia. Well, that's what happens when the country is taken over by a bunch of comprador swines. Right. Hello to Alan Smith out there in Georgia. Hello to Alex Marquez from South Carolina. Judith says Musk has acquired 113 billion so far since Trump's inauguration. Well, perhaps so, but I would always be wary of the valuations of these billionaires and trillionaires. or particularly like those who are very public, high profile, like Musk is, the actual reality of his wealth is something that I would say is more suspicious than would the official figures would let on. Given that so much of the wealth that Musk is calculated to have actually actually comes from like a valuation of his assets, and he's heavily leveraged. I would say that calculating how much he's made and not made is a bit of a hard task, given how opaque Musk's finances actually are. Hello to Ben, who joins us from Hungary. Hello to Fran, who joins us from Puerto Rico. Good to have somebody joining us from that particular island. And may Puerto Rico free itself one way or the other soon. Hello to Pavel, who asks, how likely do you think is a war with Iran? It would be more lethal than the tariff policy in regards to economic impact. Do you think the American ruling class is stupid enough for this? Some of the American ruling class are stupid and insane enough to try it. I don't think they will, though, and for the very good reason that the military commanders know damn well how much a war with Iran could potentially deal an irreversible blow to not only U.S. military, to the illusion of U.S. military supremacy, but also to the global economy, and that's something which the U.S. ruling class would not recover from for a good long while. An oil crash, or should we say, an oil spike in prices, if the Iranians managed to destroy large areas of the oil infrastructure in the West Asian region. And also, it would be tremendously costly, and there's no clear plan from the US as to how they would even do it. I keep going on about this because like the US like makes a lot of noise, jumps up and down, screams a lot, but I mean, what's the total number of troops that they've got surrounding Iran at the moment that are publicly disclosed? There may be more, but as far as I'm aware, there's 13,000 or so actual total, which is garrisons in Saudi, Gulf states, the few that are still in Iraq, the few that are in Syria, and a few other places. That's not an invasion force. And that story that came out about them having Bagram Air Force Base back, that wasn't true. So what are they going to do? How are they going to attack Iran? Now, I've been into this before, but like when they ran scenarios about an attack on Iran, it did not go well, and that was 20 years ago. And Iran's had a long time to dig in terms of building bomb-proof military facilities that are built to withstand the heaviest ordnance that the US has, other than a nuclear weapon, which they wouldn't drop a nuke on Iran because it would be a tantamount to a declaration of war against China and Russia as well. I don't think the Chinese and the Russians would allow the US to do it and get away with it. So it's tremendously difficult for them to take on Iran. This isn't a question of like knocking over the squalid regime of Saddam Hussein, which had been starved by US sanctions for over a decade, which had been abandoned by all of its former allies, which had no one to help it. Iran's a much, much more powerful country than Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and has not only that, has a very strong mass base of the population who are prepared to fight with arms in hand and die to defend the achievements of the Iranian Revolution of 1979 to 80 and the subsequent developments therein. They've got a powerful military which can inflict severe damage on the United States. They have the capacity, they say they have the capacity to target Diego Garcia itself, where the US aircraft are launched from. So this isn't an easy task, and they've shown no indication that they actually have the first idea of what they would do, other than what they've been doing in Yemen, which is ineffectually bombing civilian areas to try and terrorize the Yemenis into submission hasn't worked, wouldn't work on Iran either, and would lead to a disastrous result for the US. So what the US will do is to Iran is more terrorism, more attempts at sort of color revolution type operations, doubling down on the sanctions, even though that hasn't worked, and trying various different machinations such as assassination, like I said, more terrorism activities, more backing of the Balochi and the Kurdish separatists, more subversion, more propaganda. That's all they can do. Yeah, they could try a bombing campaign, but that would go very badly for them and their stooge regimes in the region as well. So there's very little they can actually do against Iran without triggering a full-blown war, which is, I would say, it is unlikely that the US would be able to win it. The US can't even sustain the effort in Ukraine. They're trying to get out of that. They can't uproot the Ansar Allah movement in liberated Yemen. The Israeli regime lost its war against Hamas. They could not beat Hezbollah. The only win that the US and the Israelis got in the last year was when the Syrian government imploded due to internal treachery. So they're not winning. So how on earth are they going to take on Iran and stand a chance of victory? They're not, which is why they're now negotiating with Iran in Oman. And whether that will lead to anything, I don't know. But they know, the military men in the US know very well, the more sane of them, that a war against Iran will be a complete disaster. Trump might be a chauvinist, a lunatic in some respects, but he's not completely stupid. He doesn't want to front up the greatest military disaster since the closing days of the Vietnam War. So what we'll get is more of the same. Trump can't get and won't get a renewal of like any kind of nuclear deal through Congress. And the Iranians have said they want any deal that is signed with any US administration to actually be passed through the House and the Senate, which he couldn't get it. He couldn't get anything like the old JCPOA through the House or the Senate. The Democrats would vote against him just because, and his own party would split. In fact, mostly his own party would turn on him. So what can he do? He can't do anything. There's no deal that the Iranians will ever sign that Trump could agree to. There's no real way to actually attack Iran without sustaining very significant casualties and massive global economic destruction, which the Trump administration is now desperate to avoid, hence the rollback on the tariffs. So what's he got? Nothing. He's a naked emperor. I mean, like the Chinese have now been putting the old Mao quote on their airwaves again about imperialism being a paper tiger. It is a paper tiger. It's like in theory, there's loads of things they can try and do to Iran, but Iran has moves to counter almost all of them. And Iran has powerful allies now that aren't just going to give up the strategic partnerships that they've got with Iran for vague promises from Trump. So the US is stuck, just as Biden was stuck. They can't knock Iran over. They've tried regime change operation after regime change operation. They've tried terrorism. They've tried exploiting internal divisions, which are there. There are internal contradictions in Iran, which the US has continually tried to exploit, has so far failed. So they're stuck. Now, of course, we should never rule out the imperialists doing something incredibly stupid as they get more desperate. But I don't think even the Trump administration is stupid enough to wade into a full-blown war with Iran that they are not going to win. Okay. So where else? Where are we now? Pavel, I hope that answered your question. Hello to Skylar from California. Hello to Chris Thomas from Conway from Salt Lake City. I drove through there many, many years ago. Hello to Zane Mudassir. To Mushkin, Albert Witch, who says, and it's not as if the US has a huge fleet of aircraft with which to prosecute an air campaign. They're down to a scant 1,000 tactical aircraft, including their reserve fleet. Yeah, they don't have it. They don't have the necessary equipment. They don't have the necessary manpower. They don't have a viable plan. They've got nothing. This is paper tiger time. Alan says that if they're high on their own supply of imperial arrogance, they might think they can win anything. That's what they've got a lot of the population believing. Well, a lot of the population can believe all kinds of things. When the US aircraft carrier sinks off the coast of Iran, and when Diego Garcia gets hit, when the body bags start coming home, the sudden realization will dawn on them. And also, as we'll discuss with regard to the tariffs, like a full-blown war with Iran would require a massive upsurge in military production, and the US military-industrial complex is too bloated, too worn down, too useless to actually produce anything other than profits for its owners. But in terms of mass-producing war material, they couldn't do that in a hurry. Like the US, some in the US still think they've got the industrial base of 1945. They don't. Industrially, they can't do a war with Iran either. Yeah, and once the Americans realized that there's a reason why the Israelis turned back from their assault on Iran, or their attempted assault on Iran, because one of their planes got locked onto by either an Iranian radar and missile system or one of the Russian missile systems, and they realized they would lose a load of planes if they carried on the attempted assault, so they backed off. And the American ruling class and the American political leadership are all cowards. They're all terrified of being found out. They don't want to oversee like a mass casualty event because they're very afraid of what the actual response from the population might be. Yes, you would get a wave of jingoism and like tub thumping, pseudo patriotism, but that wouldn't last too long. And when it got revealed that not only could the people who started a war with Iran not win it, but they didn't even have the economic and industrial setup there to win it, that all these people, all these US personnel had died for absolutely nothing, well, Trump would get turned on by many in his own base very, very quickly. And there would be an enormous amount of instability unleashed in the United States. They're terrified of that. That's why they won't bring back the draft. Hello to Bart. Hello to Alexander Lukta. Yepek says, I have an economic related question. Do you think the purchasing power parity most accurately represents the people as to how well off people are in contrast to GDP? Well, I wouldn't say it's a perfectly accurate measurement, but it's a more accurate measurement. GDP metric includes all kinds of shit, such as like health insurance payments and like other insurance type payouts and profit margins and things like that. Completely non-productive, parasitic bits of the U.S. economy are included in that, which make it look bigger. Whereas in actual fact, like the purchasing power parity measures more real economic activity. So it's not perfect, but it's better than the GDP measurement. Judith asks, why is Iran even agreeing to third-party talks? Probably because of the pressures within the Iranian political system. There are those within the Iranian system who may be represented by those around the Pezeshkian administration who would take a deal at any price, at almost any price, if they could get away with it. They are held in check by those who are more consistently anti-imperialist, or at least anti-imperialist, because there's a group of compradors in Iran that aren't at all. And so this represents like the balance of power within Iran, I would say. And also the Iranian leadership has consistently said it doesn't seek a war. So if the US is prepared to engage in third-party talks, then why not do it and make the demand that they have apparently made to the US for a nuclear-free region, which of course the US will never agree to, because that means that the Israeli nuke gets put on the table, which Trump cannot agree to, nor could Biden. So these third-party talks will go nowhere because the US will not accede to the Iranian demands, and Iran can't capitulate to the US demands, because the only demand that the US really has for Iran is for complete surrender, a Libya-type deal. You give up everything, we give you nothing, and then eventually, when you've disarmed yourself, we'll kill you later. It's not much of a deal, is it? And the Iranians aren't stupid enough to take it either. Hello to Enigma. Hello to Comrade Ian Foster. Hello to Montana Creed. Hello to Xavier Coombs. Okay, so getting to the first part of this, I'm just going to pop over into the video clip bit here, if you'll bear with me. So we're going to start with a certain J.D. Vance and what he has to say about things, and then I'll come back and I'll comment on this with reference to the tariff policy.
Because there were two conceits that our leadership class had when it came to globalization. The first is assuming that we can separate. Because there were two conceits that our leadership class had when it came to globalization. Because there were two conceits that our leadership class had when it came to globalization. The first is assuming that we can separate the making of things from the design of things. The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else. And yeah, some people might lose their jobs in manufacturing, but they could learn to design, or to use a very popular phrase, learn to code. But I think we got it wrong. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things. There are network effects, as you all well understand. The firms that design products work with firms that manufacture. They share intellectual property, they share best practices, and they even sometimes share critical employees. Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends. Now, that was the first conceit of globalization. I think the second is that cheap labor is fundamentally a crutch, and it's a crutch that inhibits innovation. I might even say that it's a drug that too many American firms got addicted to. Now, if you can make a product more cheaply, it's far too easy to do that rather than to innovate. And whether we were offshoring factories to cheap labor economies or importing cheap labor through our immigration system, cheap labor became the drug of Western economies. And I'd say that if you look in nearly every country from Canada to the UK that imported large amounts of cheap labor, you've seen productivity stagnate. I don't think that's not a total happenstance. I think that the connection is very direct. Now, one of the debates you hear on the minimum wage, for instance, is that increases in the minimum wage force firms to automate. So a higher wage at McDonald's means more kiosks. And whatever your views on the wisdom of the minimum wage, I'm not going to comment on that here. Companies innovating in the absence of cheap labor is a good thing. I think most of you are not worried about getting cheaper and cheaper labor. You're worried about innovating, about building new things, about the old formulation of technology is doing more with less. You guys are all trying to do more with less every single day. And so I'd ask my friends, both on the tech optimist side and on the populist side, not to see the failure of the logic of globalization as a failure of innovation. Indeed, I'd say that globalization's hunger for cheap labor is a problem precisely because it's been bad for innovation. Both our working people, our populists, and our innovators gathered here today have the same enemy. And the solution, I believe, is American innovation.
Right, so that's the US Vice President there, talking a slightly more coherent variety of drivel than his fellow cabinet members and inner circle. But it is drivel nonetheless. Now, let's deal with the last point first, which is that the cheap labor means lower productivity, and that's part of the reason why globalization has ultimately failed. And this is his attempt to sort of square the circle between the tech guys who want continued large-scale migration, as people like Elon Musk made clear earlier this year, and the so-called populists who, of course, want to freeze on migration or to reverse it, in actual fact. Now, where Vance goes completely wrong here is where he's talking about the difference between He's talking about innovation being restricted by addiction to cheap labor. That's completely wrong. You see, what in actual fact happens in each wave of innovation of means of production since like the 1840s, capitalism has replaced more skilled in labor with less skilled labor, and has tried to flatten wages as a result. That happens in each wave of, as Vance puts it, innovation. So, what do we mean by this? Well, in his early economic works, such as Wage, Labor, and Capital, and Wages, Price, and Profit, Marx explains that one of the things that happens when you say, for instance, you got like a wave of worker militancy in Britain in the 1840s and 1850s, what happened was you get this wave of militancy, and then the capitalists innovate a more advanced means of production, which means they can do away with the more skilled, higher paid jobs and replace them ultimately with lower skilled, lower wage jobs. So the idea that low wages or are shall we say, a barrier to, or they're stopping innovation, that isn't actually correct. Low wages is what capital constantly seeks, and because it constantly seeks that, that is actually part of what drives innovation under capitalism. Capitalism constantly innovates in order to find ways to pay workers lower hourly amounts or lower daily amounts. Bear in mind that the baseline for capitalism, when it comes to wages, always returns to the minimum amount needed to keep the worker on his or her feet for 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 hours a day, however long the shifts are. So he's got that completely wrong. And he's got it completely wrong because, of course, not only is he not a Marxist, he's trying to square the circle in Trump's political coalition there, which is, of course, you get Peter Thiel on one side and people like Peter Navarro on the other, with Musk in the mix as well. So, to clarify the point here, each wave of innovation of means of production under capitalism is often motivated precisely by the desire to cheapen labor as much as possible, to de-skill it, to go from skilled machine operators and craftsmen to, in the case of Britain in the 19th century, child labor and the labor of lower paid women workers in the mills. And that was the motivation for them to get to that point. So again, like, Vance gets it completely round his neck. Now, the other point that he makes there, and will lead us into a discussion about the tariffs, is that he says globalization has gone wrong, and he implies that what was meant to happen was that the high value production, high value chains are high value supply chains are kept within the United States and the other imperialist nations, and they are kept there whilst the lower value production goes out to other areas of the world. Now, over the last 30 years, this was the plan of the US, was to stick a lot of this into China. Stick a lot of the low value production, whilst the high value stuff, the high tech stuff, remained almost the monopoly of the US and its bloc allies. Though, of course, as we'll come to in just a moment, these allies are a rather shaky collection, given that the US imperialists and their European allies and their British allies are all constantly trying to knife each other, cut each other's throats, steal each other's market shares, and steal each other's industries. This is the nature of allies under imperialism. Now, what Vance is saying in that section of the speech you just saw is it's closer to the truth. And he comes close to the truth in certain other things he said, where they say, well, globalization's gone wrong because basically China stepped out of its role. And here we get to the tariff question. because in other contributions from Trump administration officials, they give away some more of the game. So Vance is a little bit more straightforward, and he says that what's gone wrong is that the Chinese are now leading many areas of like high tech, highly innovative production these days. They're not just a repository. They're a place where the US goes to access cheap labor anymore. They're doing very high value things. They're producing very high value things. They are innovating in areas such as quantum computing and the automation of means of production in a way that the US just can't compete with. So this is the essence of the US's problem with China, and the reason why what the people will go on to talk about Navarro and Myron are foaming at the mouth is because of this. The plan that was cooked up from, at least really from the Nixon-Kissinger era, but certainly from the George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton era, has all gone wrong. What was meant to happen to China was that they would be a source of cheap labor, and that this would drive profits, create a stronger domestic Chinese bourgeoisie, which would be comprador in nature and would escape the control of the CPC, or that they would gain control over the CPC, and that you would get your Chinese Gorbachev would emerge, and that the growing power of the comprador bourgeois would destroy what was left of the power of the CPC, what was left of the power of the working class in China, and that China would be permanently, or at least for the next generation or two, reduced to a weakened state akin to Russia in the 90s, where all of its labor and all of its resources could be easily exploited. And this is what was meant in the 1990s when various US and British government officials would say, well, what we're looking to do is to encourage the growth of democracy via engagement with China. Now, you got to decode the bullshit. When they mean a growth in democracy, what they actually really mean when they say we're going to encourage a growth in democracy, what they really mean is that what they're going to try and do is to grow comprador elements in China, encourage the growth of comprador elements in China that will seek to overthrow the Chinese system or destroy it from within. That's what they meant. That's what the British and the Americans were hoping for. Now, I'm not done the necessary reading on how close they got to achieving that, but they had certain assets in play towards the end of the 2000s, which could have secured them a win in that direction, given different circumstances. But what they got wrong and that they underestimated was the fact that there is still a strong revolutionary wing to the CPC. And this wing was strengthened considerably by the events of 2008, as we'll go on to talk about. And it's this change in the CPC responding to both the international situation and also the domestic situation in China itself that creates the Xi Jinping era, which we'll come to in just a moment. But the central problem, again, to go back to Vance's point, is China didn't stay in its lane. They were supposed to just remain a source of cheap labor. They've moved into areas that the US thought they'd always have a monopoly on, such as high-tech, high-value production, and the US cannot tolerate that. There's other things in play as well, but we'll come on to talk about those in just a moment. So, going over to a certain Mr. Peter Navarro. Now, Navarro is a big-time advisor to Trump, and is widely regarded as one of the brains, so-called, behind the tariff policy. Now, Navarro, a couple of weeks ago, actually just a week ago on April the 7th, published an article, an editorial in the Financial Times, which the Financial Times readership apparently didn't appreciate, considering there's numerous complaints about Navarro's point of view from various British and American capitalists listed under the article. Now, Navarro comes up with the justifications for the tariff policy. Now, I think some of this he does believe in. Some of it, a lot of it is bullshit. Again, the real reasons for the tariff policy we've kind of gone into already, but we will come back to. The real target is China, both in terms of China internally, and also China's ability to do business with various different countries all over the world, and the dominant trading position that the Chinese now have. So Navarro, in this piece in the FT, whinges that the WTO is being very unfair to the United States, and that the result, as he says, is a national emergency that threatens both our economic prosperity and national security. Now, what he's talking about here, and I'll quote directly from his article, is he says, at the heart of this crisis is a trade deficit in goods that has ballooned to more than $1 trillion annually. The economic models of free trade that predict chronic trade imbalances will always be eliminated through price adjustments via exchange rates are dead wrong. Now, he goes on to talk about a U.S. trade deficit in manufactured goods that has been run to now 60% of US GDP in 2024. And that's true. Now, the issue, though, is that the US is not primarily a commodity exporter anymore. The US is primarily an exporter of services. Now, according to the Statista website, the US runs a trade surplus when it comes to services, and this includes things like research and development, business services, management consultancy, what's defined as technical and trade related services, entertainment, travel, transportation. All of that comes under the services descriptor. And if you look at the US's own statistics on this, the Bureau of Economic Affairs, and you look at like the increase in what are the biggest spikes in terms of increase in trade in services. So you've got things like business services, which have consistently gone up. You've got things like health-related services, which have consistently increased. You've got other things such as like consultancy on like management consultancy, accounting, things like that. Then you've got like transport. But the biggest single increase is in things like insurance, various different financial services. In fact, the financial services element of US exports has really continued to explode in recent years, only going down slightly since its peak in 2021. So what the US is good at exporting now is non-tangible things. It's not commodities. It's, well, if you want to be unkind about things, you could say it's bullshit. But that reflects not the some sort of conspiracy against America. That reflects the United States' position as the center of a network of neocolonial relationships and a neocolonial system that's been built particularly over the last 34, 35 years. So Navarro goes on to complain about the fact that the driver of U.S. manufacturing decline is the declaration of that China as being a given most favored nation status, which was something that was given to China by the Clinton administration. He also says, and I quote, "Foreign interests have taken over vast swaths of U.S. farmland, housing, tech companies, and even parts of our food supply." Now, this is an interesting claim by Navarro, and I just want to deal with this here because he's claiming that, of course, these ghastly foreigners have taken over the U.S. land. So you look up, though, who are the biggest owners of land in the United States. So, in terms of the amount that they own. So this is from the source I'm using here is called the landreport.com. Top 10 landowners in the United States. Who are they? Well, there's the Emerson family, who own over 2,440,000 acres. There's Ted Turner of CNN fame, who owns over 2 million. There's Stan Kroenke, the sports billionaire. There's the Reed family, the Irving family, the Buck family, the Singleton family, the King Ranch heirs, Pingree heirs, and also someone who you might be familiar with, a certain Jeff Bezos is in there. Bill Gates is in there. Various other holding companies that are more unnamed, but the biggest landowners inside the United States, the biggest land barons, if you will, they're all Americans. So if Navarro to claim that it's the ghastly foreigners that are compromising the wonderful system of American land ownership is garbage. Like, the biggest landowners inside the United States, according to research data gathered in the United States, are all American. So if there's a problem with land ownership in America, it's that the land is owned by an ever smaller group of oligarchs, most of whom I'd never heard of before I looked that up. So again, it's not foreign interests that are endangering the US farmer, it's the US oligarchy. Now, as for buying up housing, well, one of the most aggressive expanders into buying up housing and either selling it or renting it as a corporate landlord is, of course, BlackRock. Again, an American company. And as for Navarro whinging about tech companies and parts of the food supply chain being bought up by foreign interests, well, that's what happens when you run an open market. That's what happens when the US is in a complicated series of trading relationships with its so-called allies. This is what happens when you sell things off. And you can't then turn around and start whinging that the ghastly foreigners have taken over when they've put an awful lot of money back into the United States. Again, this hasn't benefited the American worker or in any respect, but it has benefited the American ruling class, which of course Navarro doesn't want to talk about. Now, he goes on to make several more extraordinary claims, such as that the stagnation of the wages of American workers since 2001 is down to the role played by China, which is, again, an absolutely bizarre claim that we really will have to deal with here. Because he claims, of course, that due to the Chinese taking all these manufacturing jobs, that this has caused the US to stagnate in terms of wages. So he claims the following, and I'll quote directly from his article. Since 1979, the year that manufacturing jobs peaked in America and the Tokyo round of the Global General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs and Trade ushered in major most favored nation driven tariff reductions, the US has lost 6.8 million manufacturing jobs. Since China joined the WTO in 2001, real median weekly earnings in the US have largely stagnated, rising little more than 10% over the entire period. So, is Navarro's claim here true? Well, no, it's not. And if we go to data provided by the Pew Research, we can see that in terms of actual purchasing power, the purchasing power of the US worker in terms of hourly wages in the United States has barely moved since the middle of the 1960s. So let's just repeat that. Like, the purchasing power of the US worker remained roughly the same from 1964 through to when this data was compiled, which is 2018. That's 7 years ago. I don't think it will have changed that dramatically since then. So what you have is US wages held down consistently for over 30 years before Navarro comes up with his bullshit figures. And even if we take a more, shall we say, circumspect estimate, like most sources agree that the year that the US wages started falling behind was at the very latest, the early 1980s, like 1980. But this figure shows that from Pew Research shows that purchasing power of US workers has remained roughly the same. It's barely moved in over 60 years. Why? Because, of course, the US system, US capitalism, went into crisis in the middle 1960s, and then relentless attacks were launched on the US working class by the ruling class ever since the middle of the 1960s. There was a big eruption in industrial struggles in the 1970s, and before Reagan moves in and crushes of course, most famously with PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, but many other industrial struggles in the 1980s were lost, and then the US was engaged in comprehensive deindustrialization all the way through the 1980s, and it did explode further in the 1990s, but that's not just because of the ghastly Chinese or anything. That's the logical progression. That is the progression which is hard baked into imperialism. Every imperialist power goes through the same thing, and then the same bullshit debates come up in the bourgeois political system. And here, I'm going to just pause to read to you from a novel by a guy called Robert Tressel. It's called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, and this is from the very early part of the 20th century. And I'm just going to read to you a bit of this because what it shows is that what the US is doing now, the British had already been there a century beforehand. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this to you to illustrate this particular point. Much better left alone, chimed in old Jack Lyndon sagely. Argufying about politics generally ends up with a bloody row and does no good to nobody. At this there was a murmur of approval from several of the others. Most of them were averse from arguing or disputing about politics. If two or three men of similar opinions happened to be together, they might discuss such things in a friendly and superficial way, but in a mixed company it was better left alone. The fiscal policy emanated from the Tory party. That was the reason why some of them were strongly in favour of it, and for the same reason others were opposed to it. Some of them were under the delusion that they were conservatives. Similarly, others imagined themselves to be liberals. As a matter of fact, most of them were nothing. They knew about as much about the public affairs of their own country as they did of the condition of affairs in the planet Jupiter. Now, what the argument in this chapter between the imagined conservatives and liberal advocates in this group of building workers that the novel's focused on is about free trade versus protection. And what the socialist character called Owen says to them is that, well, why are you arguing on behalf of this conservative and this liberal party? They're both vehemently opposed to your interests. But the reason why I cite that particular piece is because the argument between the workmen there is based on their reading of like conservative and liberal journals. The conservative journals at that time, early 1900s, were arguing that the British Empire cost too much, that there was too much foreign competition for British manufacturing, that there were too many foreigners entering the country, that the empire was a huge burden on Britain. This was a big talking point in the later 19th century. That the empire was a big burden on Britain, and it was draining money out of Britain, and it needed to pay its way more, and it was obscene when the British ruling class, or a section of them, started arguing this way, because of course they'd looted and destroyed huge swaths of the world, and then started complaining when the effects of imperialism started to bite. So what you actually saw in the later 19th and early 20th century in this country was the effects of imperialism start to kick in. So you start to see deindustrialization. You start to see capital flight out of the country, and where the British capitalist class stopped investing in Britain, started investing in empire countries, started building up industries they started actually reinvesting, having destroyed Indian industry. They started actually investing in some industry in India because, of course, the labor was ultra cheap. And the argument raged at the time about whether all the money was leaving Britain and more imports were coming in and less was being produced in the country. Well, that's just the way in which the imperialist system develops. There is, Marx observed, there's a strong tendency within capitalism to try and get away with making money whilst producing nothing, no commodities anyway. And the system develops under imperialism to the point where the capitalist class look outside of their home country for people to hyper-exploit. And so everything that is being argued about in the United States now was argued about in the same way with the British Empire over 100 years ago. It's the same argument. The empire costs too much. Why are we spending all this money? Why are they being so ungrateful to us? Why are we being having to accept so many foreign products? Why don't we manufacture anything anymore? It's Navarro's whinge, but 100 years before. And it's the British reactionaries and the advocates of both protectionism and free trade, as portrayed in the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists and other works. But the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists becomes more appropriate to read from every year, it seems to me. The same arguments recur in all imperialist powers, because the political hierarchy, even those who aren't just lying, and many of them are lying, don't understand why it is that manufacturing has fled elsewhere, don't understand why the movement of capital has gone against them, don't understand why what system they're running. And just as with Britain in the early 20th century, moving to more and more to a system of outsourcing its manufacturing base, the US has been doing that for over 50 years. And so they've reached the point where they are, as I said on the episode of Decline and Fall that was broadcast yesterday, the US now sits at the center of a global but decaying rapidly neocolonial system. Meaning what? Meaning, of course, they couldn't engage in direct colonialism anymore. But thanks to the collapse of the USSR via the counter-revolutions of the 1980s, the US was able to position itself in such a way as that it could outsource and offshore its manufacturing base, or large elements of it, and then in return could essentially exploit anywhere in the world, and could, much like the British did before them, move to a system where their exports were in services and management, and transportation to bring the goods back into the US, not in direct commodity production. The commodity production being outsourced, offshored, etc. And what would happen was that the tribute would flow into the US itself via the Wall Street firms, because the part of this global neocolonial system was the usage of the dollar by everybody in terms of settling trade and making payments, etc. This was a system which made a lot of profit for the US bourgeois for a generation, and now it's disintegrating. And it's disintegrating because reality has caught up. Like and this is where the Chinese come in. Chinese stepping outside of the role that the US had assigned to them as a sweatshop. And so when Vance starts going on, as he has this week, about Chinese peasants, etc., and sweatshop labor, well, the sweatshop era in China was one that the Chinese, or the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government identified as being a potential risk for them. And so that's why they've comprehensively moved in another direction. They've moved away from being a source of cheap labor and being a country with hundreds of millions of very poor workers, into being a country which has consistently worked to end extreme poverty with a great degree of success, and to develop what the Chinese leaders refer to as a moderately prosperous country. And this is something the US absolutely cannot tolerate, because if they can't control China, they're going to certainly try to destroy it. And if the Chinese won't know their place, then they have to be destroyed and subordinated. Fortunately for the Chinese and for the rest of us, the Chinese leadership via the CPC were wise enough to see this coming, and there was a change in the leadership over a decade ago, which brings in the Xi Jinping period, which emphasized what Xi Jinping refers to as high quality growth, meaning it's not growth just based on low wage work anymore. They're looking to secure lower growth rates than they got in the 2000s, but more sustainable ones based on an awful lot of domestic innovation, growth of a domestic middle class consumer market, and removing the risk that they were overly exposed to of the over-reliance on the US market. So Navarro's whinging and crying about everybody being unfair to the US and how dare you, etc. We've got to restore the balance. I mean, he's 20 years too late. Very much 20 years too late. So he goes on, Navarro does, to complain more and more about the WTO. But of course, the WTO, World Trade Organization, was the creation of the US and the British and the Europeans. And they're the ones who've dominated it. Now, they all have their disputes with each other and fall out with each other. But the reason why China was brought into the WTO by the Clinton administration was to remove barriers to cheap manufactured goods coming into the United States. And that was, again, of course, very successful from the point of view of the US ruling class back then. Again, the issue is that as the Chinese government themselves point out, they have abided by all WTO rules consistently and all the agreements they signed with the US. It's the US that keeps tearing up the agreements and then complaining that everybody's treating them with such disrespect. Again, all the same whinging that the certain sections of the British ruling class were doing in the early 20th century. Now, Navarro makes a series of threats in closing his article, including to Cambodia, Mexico, and Vietnam, that they want to stop allowing China to evade tariffs by shipping through their countries. Again, I strongly suspect that's something that will get dropped because, again, like what happened when Navarro got his way and all these tariffs were put on, the US tech giants freaked out, which is the reason why now Trump has had to exclude mobile phone and other tech components that the firms like Apple rely on from the tariffs. Because if you suddenly double or quadruple the price of an iPhone in the US, well, you might end up with a riot at an Apple store or worse, because you will then depress consumer spending on tech products, directly hitting the bottom line of the very people who enabled you to get into power in the first place. So this is where the massive contradictions in the so-called MAGA movement come into play, because Trump did receive the votes of like some significant number of pissed off American workers who believed in the lie that the tariff policy and Trump's desire to rebuild manufacturing was sincere. In actual fact, maybe people like Navarro did believe that it was going to lead to some sort of positive result, but it wasn't really about restoring US manufacturing for the US ruling class. It was really about trying to find a way to clobber China and to stop Chinese growth and to force China out of markets the US regards as its own. That's why they were levying so many tariffs on various different countries. Now, here we will turn to another scumbag in the Trump administration, the one who's admirably open about things, which is Steve Myron, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And I went through this yesterday, so I won't go through it again. But essentially, Myron portrays this as a protection racket, which is, he says you can get around tariffs by either buying more goods off the United States, particularly weapons, moving your factories to the United States, or just cutting as checks to the US Treasury. And he suggests that another way around them is for countries that are hosting a US military presence should pay for the upkeep of that presence. And what he's saying is, and again, this is a threat mainly to those who are supposedly allies of the United States. He's saying, Myron is, that if you don't pay us, we'll withdraw our protection from you. Now, what he's saying there is that you will pay for US troops to occupy your country because we are guaranteeing peace and prosperity, meaning we allow you to exist, Europe, under our protection. And if you don't pay for it, then you're fucked. Which, of course, produced the exact opposite response that Myron and co wanted, which is that the Europeans suddenly realized that they would be better served opening up negotiations with the Chinese again. So the way Myron sees it is that this is literal protection racket stuff. Stop trading with the Chinese, give us your companies, or pay us some money. And then Myron goes on to argue that, well, we'll rake in money from the tariffs one way or another, either from the money we generate from the tariffs, or people will pay us to remove the tariffs. And through that, we'll be able to get ourselves a tax cut. The other notable thing from, because this is, again, the policy of the Trump administration is to do, again, a pretty standard Republican agenda, which is tax cuts for the rich, dressed up as tax cuts for workers, just like it was in his first term. The other point that Myron makes in this article, it's always an address, I think, to the Hudson Institute that's hosted on the White House website, is that the other thing that they want is, of course, to blame the Chinese for everything. And Myron, I mean, following Navarro made the extraordinary claim that, like, the Chinese gaining access to the WTO was part of what suppressed American workers' wages when they've been suppressed since the 60s, long before China did reform and opening up. In fact, before even the period of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Myron goes on to blame the 2008 crash and other foreign financial institutions. He blames China and other foreign financial institutions for the excessive lending of in terms of mortgages in the US. Now, who was it that deregulated the mortgage market? Who was it that deregulated the banking system? It wasn't the Chinese. It was the Clinton administration, followed by the George W. Bush administration, who encouraged the unsustainable lending practices of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Well, it was, again, Clinton started it, George W. Bush completed it. And then the Chinese, in actual fact, as we have covered on this program many times before, not only did they not cause it, they helped to bail out the United States by buying loads of US dollar bonds, by buying gigantic amounts of US debt and keeping the dollar afloat and keeping the US afloat as a market for Chinese goods. After they'd done that and reduced the risk to themselves of a US collapse, the Chinese then start reorienting things and, in actual fact, start reducing the risk to themselves of this, like, unpredictable, fading, flailing hegemon. So, like, Myron's claim is complete garbage. It's literally like typical, like, distraction stuff, like blame the Chinese for a crisis that was completely created by the degeneracy of the degeneration of the US imperialist system. And, of course, the gigantic overproduction of capital since then, before and since the 2008 crisis, which continually fuels speculative bubbles in the US economy, which leads to more destabilization. Now, what this shows is that the people surrounding Trump have, if we take them at face value, and I think we should, let's take their words seriously, like, haven't the faintest idea about what to do. Navarro sees that the manufacturing has declined, and he sees that that is bad, but has no idea why it's declined or is lying about it. Myron just comes across as a guy who is essentially trying to run a sort of cheap protection racket, a sort of a white shoe version of Tony Soprano. And these are the guys that have been building the policy, along with, like, Besant and Howard Lutnick and people like that. They haven't the faintest idea of how to revive US industry, nor do they, some of them, I don't think Besant or Lutnick have much of an interest in doing it. The so-called intellectuals, Navarro and Myron, again, don't have much of a clue either. This is why they're continually lying about all the problems facing American workers. And these geniuses are who delivered the tariff policy. So is it really a surprise that when they had no idea what kind of an enemy they were facing in the Chinese, they had apparently no idea that the Chinese had reduced their risk factor, their exposure to the unpredictability of the American political system, that they had no idea that what would happen when they did this was that rather than being a flight to the dollar, there was a flight out of and away from the dollar, and that their own backers in the form of the tech oligarchs would turn on them when, of course, suddenly their phones and other electronic equipment that is made, or how its component parts are made in China, suddenly was looking at a doubling of the price and a collapse in sales. So this is a total disaster on every single level. They have completely failed and will continue to fail. And that Trump is now exempting things and is backing down all over the place. Eventually, there will be some kind of call will go through, not from Trump, but from somebody inside the US government, will go through to the Chinese, and some kind of arrangement may well be made. Doesn't matter, though, because the Chinese have already moved on. They realized over a decade ago that this day was going to come. It was going to come whether it was Trump or whether it was Biden. Remember, Biden's behavior towards China was no better than Trump's. The tactics was slightly different, but the aim was the same. But it's too late. It's all over. This game has been lost. What's been revealed this week, and it's very apt that the Chinese government was bringing out the Mao quotes again, is that Mao was right. This is a paper tiger. This is all over. It's not a question of if the US can revive itself and it's manufacturing based under capitalism. It can't. The US ruling class is too degenerate to do that. The cost of US labor is still too high. To get there, you would need a catastrophic war to be waged upon the US worker, which I wouldn't rule out them trying to do, but it would, of course, open up opportunities for American communists to bring the truth to the working class when Donald starts attacking them face on, full on. So, pause there for questions, comments, etc. So, just going to troll back through the comments here. Well, to answer Orange's point, the future for dollar trade is going to remain dollar's going to remain a big currency for some time to come, but it will be slowly edged out from the dominant position it has. I mean, when you've got the Japanese bailing on the dollar, which is what happened in the last week, that really is all over because Japan's an occupied puppet state of the US. But if even they've decided to bail, they've got severe problems, and de-dollarization is only going to speed up now. Right. Chris Cox says, I've lost count of the amount of times I've seen those rich investors on the Dragon's Den who advise the entrepreneur doing the pitch to outsource to cut production costs. Well, it makes complete sense from a capitalist point of view. Capital is a complicated beast in that it, has as long as the capitalist gets to sit in Britain, the production can be done anywhere. Capitalism has zero loyalty to national boundaries to the degree in which they will employ somebody. Now, of course, they need the national boundaries and they need the national government to enforce their property claims and to enforce their will upon recalcitrant nations. So it's not true that capital has no country, and it's not true that capitalists don't value nation states or that they've moved beyond nation states. That was always garbage. It's that they have no loyalty and no love for the American or the British worker. Of course not. They never did. They regretted creating the proletariat in the first place. So if they can outsource and get it done in hyper-exploitative conditions elsewhere, they won't hesitate to do so. They never would. That's why you should take lectures on patriotism from the bourgeois with a gigantic bucket load of salt. Again, their patriotism goes as far as their property interests and no further. Okay. Judith says, I don't believe you should take them at their word. What they say is intended for low information voters. No, I don't agree with you. Because the justification that Navarro wrote was in the Financial Times. Now, again, I know there are low information capitalists, but the Navarro was addressing his own class or the class he serves. Myron was addressing the Hudson Institute. Again, he's addressing capitalists. This isn't an article. These aren't articles that were written in the New York Post or the Sun in Britain, or aimed at the low information voter, as you put it. This was aimed at other members of the capitalist class. So some of them do believe this stuff. Never underestimate the delusions of the ruling class. These people aren't geniuses, and they often don't understand the system they're in the middle of. They don't. I mean, some of them do. Some of them do are made to read Marx and are made to read all 3 volumes of Capital to fully understand the system. There's many accounts of finance guys reading it and basically gaining a greater knowledge of the system from that than anything by Milton fucking Friedman. But many of them in the system do believe in the bullshit that they're talking about. yes, they lie constantly, and yes, that they are crooks, but some of them do believe their own justifications. I think Navarro does believe in a lot of that. He's making a lot of it up as well, but he believes in the central core of the argument, which is that tariffs will help recreate industry. I think he does believe that. I think Myron does believe in this sort of protection racket stuff. So, okay. The owner class has no care for the little people. Well, they never did, and they never will, you know. Charlie Chaplin says, in South Africa, there is no effective left-wing resistance to the ANC's rightward deviations. Well, I take it from that you're not convinced by the economic freedom fighters or the Umkhonto we Sizwe, Jacob Zuma's lot. Just going back up through the comments here. Okay. Almeida says they tried it in Tiananmen, they tried it in Hong Kong, not going to happen, with reference to a color revolution. I think the Rumble chat in the Rumble studio seems to be running slow, so I'm just going to pop into here. Okay, right. So, let's just have a look here. Yeah. Right, so what we're going to do, I'm going to draw things to a close for tonight because we've been going for an hour and 12. I talked for longer than I probably meant to there, so I didn't leave a lot of time for questions. So I think what I'll do is we'll do a follow-up to this tomorrow where we're going to deal with the nationalisation of British steel and some other questions. And then we will do our Q&A to catch up on things on Tuesday coming up. So be sure to join me again for that one. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. We've got 257 of you watching on YouTube. We have 4 on Rumble, 1 on Locals, 1 on Twitch. And how many do we have of you on Twitter or X, as we should refer to it now? We've got 245 of you there, so good numbers for tonight. Thanks everybody who's tuned in. Be sure to like and share this stream. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. And thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I will be back with you again tomorrow. Until then, good night, and I wish you all a restful night.